Hello dear students, today we are going to discuss the topic on effect of ionizing and non-ionizing radiations on living systems. The main objectives of the topic are to know what radiations are, to discuss about the penetrating power of ionizing radiations, to find out the effects of ionizing radiations on living systems, to find out the effects of non-ionizing radiations on living systems. Now, what radiations are? Radiation is the energy that comes from a source and travels through some material or through space. It's the energy in the form of waves or streams of particles. Radiation is simply a mechanism whereby energy passes through space. There are two forms of radiations, ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. First, ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiations are capable of knocking electrons out of their orbits around atoms, upsetting the electron-proton balance and giving the atom a positive charge. Ionizing radiation includes the radiation that comes from both natural and man-made radioactive materials. Various types of ionizing radiations and their penetrating power can be studied under the following headings. First, penetrating power of alpha radiation. Alpha radiation consists of alpha particles that are made up of 2 protons and 2 neutrons each and that carry a double positive charge. Due to their relatively large mass and charge, they have an extremely limited ability to penetrate matter. Second, penetrating power of beta radiation. Beta radiation consists of charged particles that are ejected from an atom's nucleus and that are physically identical to electrons. Beta particles generally have a negative charge, are very small and can penetrate more deeply than alpha particles. However, most beta radiation can be stopped by small amounts of shielding such as sheets of plastic, glass or metal. Third, penetrating power of photon radiation. There are two types of photon radiations, that is gamma and X radiation. Gamma radiation consists of photons that originate from within the nucleus and X radiation consists of photons that originate from outside the nucleus and are typically lower in energy than gamma radiation. Photon radiation can penetrate very deeply and sometimes can only be reduced in intensity by materials that are quite dense, such as lead or steel. In general, photon radiation can travel much greater distances than alpha or beta radiation. Fourth, penetrating power of neutron radiation. Apart from cosmic radiation, spontaneous fission is the only natural source of neutrons. A common source of neutrons is the nuclear reactor, in which the splitting of a uranium or plutonium nucleus is accompanied by the emission of neutrons. The neutrons emitted from one fission event can strike the nucleus of an adjacent atom and cause another fission event, inducing a chain reaction. The production of nuclear power is based upon this principle. All other sources of neutrons depend on reactions where a nucleus is bombarded with a certain type of radiation and where the resulting effect on the nucleus is the emission of a neutron. Neutrons are able to penetrate tissues and organs of the human body when the radiation source is outside the body. Now, let us discuss biological effects of ionizing radiation. The deleterious effects of ionizing radiations on human tissue can be divided into two types, non-stochastic or deterministic and stochastic effects. First, deterministic effects. Deterministic effects only occur once a threshold of exposure has been exceeded. The severity of deterministic effects increases as the dose of exposure increases. Deterministic effects are caused by significant cell damage or death. The physical effects will occur when the cell death burden is large enough to cause obvious functional impairment of a tissue or organ. First, dermal effects. Clinically observable dermal radiation effects ranging from erythema to necrosis have been observed following external beta, gamma and X-ray exposure above threshold doses. The erythema appears several hours after exposure and disappears within a day. Much greater radiation doses lead to a second erythema several weeks later, which lasts for about a month. Greater doses lead to loss of hair, ulceration and necrosis. Second, ocular effects. The lens of the eye is not among the most radiosensitive tissues in the body, but it has less efficient repair capabilities than many other tissues. Exposure of the lens to sufficient doses of ionizing radiation results in cataract formation, which can range from minimally detectable opacities that do not impair vision to blindness. Cataract occurs due to accumulation of damaged or dead cells within the lens, the removal of which cannot take place naturally. Third, respiratory effects. The respiratory tract has long been known to be a target organ of both internal and external radiation. Respiratory effects have been reported in humans who had received radiotherapy for breast cancer and those who had been accidentally overexposed. Irradiation of large portions of one or both lungs initially results in alterations in blood flow, initially manifested as edema and later as pneumonitis and pulmonary fibrosis. Fourth, central nervous system effects. As a whole, the central nervous system of the adult human and animals is extremely resistant to the effects of radiation. In contrast to the rapidly dividing cells of the gastrointestinal and hematopoietic systems, the central nervous system has a relatively static population of cells, with cell mitosis occurring between long intervals of latency. This allows cells to be resistant to much larger doses of radiation because the cells have much more time to repair themselves before they multiply. The brain appears to be sensitive to ionizing radiation only at extremely large doses. Necrosis of the brain may occur within 3 years after a 5,500 rad dose received over a 6-week time frame. Fifth, acute radiation syndrome or radiation sickness. Acute radiation syndrome occurs within a few hours to months after exposure to high-dose radiation. The principal signs and symptoms include vomiting within a few hours, followed by diarrhea, reduced blood cell counts, bleeding, epilation, and temporary male sterility. Diarrhea results from damage to cells lining the intestines, reduction in blood cells from death of hematopoietic stem cells in bone marrow, and bleeding from declining blood platelets generated from such stem cells. Hair is lost due to damage to hair root cells. Except for vomiting, these signs and symptoms are closely related to frequency of cell division. If the radiation dose is low, the syndrome will seldom, if ever, occur. Conversely, if the dose is high, death can occur within 10 to 20 days after exposure due to severe intestinal damage or subsequently within 1 or 2 months, mostly from bone marrow failure. Sixth, gastrointestinal effects. It's characterized by nausea and diarrhea, which typically subsides after several days, followed by a short latent period. Symptoms then return, which include white blood cell depression, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and massive electrolyte imbalances, which ultimately will result in death. The gastrointestinal epithelium. which includes the epithelium covering the stomach and intestines, is the most sensitive to the effects of radiation due to the high cell turnover rates. Very large doses to the germinal epithelium of the stomach and intestines damage these cells, rendering them unable to divide and replace older. As a result, ulceration, sloughing of cells, diarrhea, and hemorrhage may occur, leading to the gastrointestinal syndrome. 7th, hematological and lymphoreticular effects. Hematological effects are one of the syndromes seen after acute doses to bone marrow. The magnitude of effect on hematopoiesis is dependent on the total dose absorbed regardless of the route of exposure. Like the gastrointestinal system, the hematopoietic system contains a large population of cells that requires the frequent replacement of senescent cells. To meet this need, a pool of undifferentiated precursor cells called stem cells in the red marrow of many bones, for example, ribs, pelvis, vertebrae, skull, and ends of long bones, undergo high rates of mitotic activity and differentiate into the various cell types to replace those that die off naturally. This pool of cells is critical for the production of replacement cell populations for erythrocytes, granulocytes, lymphocytes, and thrombocytes. The dose of radiation received by stem cells damages or kills these cells, thereby depressing the marrow activity, resulting in anemia, leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, septicemia, infections, and death. 8th, reproductive effects. Cells that reproduce frequently, such as those found in intestinal crypts, bone marrow, and the reproductive systems of animals, are more radiosensitive than cells that are highly differentiated and reproduce slowly. This radiosensitivity is dependent on the type of ionizing radiation or the source. Specific cells in the reproductive tract of both males and females replicate at accelerated rates, making them more at risk to the effects of ionizing radiation. In males, the spermatogonia are the cells most sensitive to the effects of ionizing radiation. These cells are the germ cells responsible for producing spermatocytes and later spermatids and mature sperm. Spermatids and sperm are very radioresistant to cytotoxic effects of radiation. 9. Embryotoxic effects. The rapidly dividing cells in the developing fetus, like those in the reproductive system, are also at a much higher risk of radiation damage, independent of the type of ionizing radiation or the source or route of exposure. Alpha and beta radiation cannot penetrate the mother's body tissues and the placental sac. However, gamma radiation is very penetrating and can expose the fetus. The fetus is always uniformly exposed to external gamma rays from background radiation. There may also be partial body exposure from medical X-rays. Deterministic radiation exposure effects during pregnancy depend not only on the radiation dose received but also on the gestational age at which it occurred. The embryo is relatively radioresistant during its pre-implantation phase but highly radiosensitive during its organogenesis and neuronal stem cell proliferation phases. Fetal radiosensitivity falls after this period. High levels of radiation exposure in pregnancy can lead to growth retardation, in particular microcephaly, hypospadia, microphthalmia, retinal degeneration, and optic atrophy. Now, stochastic effects. Stochastic effects occur due to the ionizing radiation effect of symmetrical translocations taking place during cell division and include the following: carcinogenic effects from ionizing radiation exposure. Cancer is the most latent harmful effect produced by ionizing radiation and the one that most people exposed to radiation are concerned about. The ability of alpha, beta and gamma radiation to produce cancer in virtually every tissue and organ in laboratory animals has been well demonstrated. The development of cancer is not an immediate effect but may take several years to develop. Radiation-induced cancers are the same types that are normally found in an unexposed individual. However, after exposure to radiation, these cancer types may occur with some increasing frequency and therefore can be detected only by epidemiological means. The mechanism by which cancer is induced in living cells is complex. The accepted theory states that the induction of cancer by exposure to radiation takes place in 3 steps. The first step is initiation, which is a mutational event caused by the effect of the radiation interacting with the cellular genome. This may involve a single gene or multiple genes on one or many chromosomes and may involve the activation of an oncogene or the mutation and subsequent activation of tumor. The second step, that's promotion, is generally thought to be unrelated to the dose of radiation received. Therefore, the latent period is clearly independent of the initial dose of radiation received. The third step involves cell transformation and proliferation, which leads to the production of new plastic cells. Second, genetic mutations. Radiation may alter the DNA within any cell. Cell damage and death that result from mutations in somatic cells occur only in the organism in which mutation occurred and are therefore termed somatic or non-heritable effects. Cancer is the most notable long-term somatic effect. In contrast, mutations that occur in germ cells, that is sperm and ova, can be transmitted to future generations and are therefore called genetic or heritable effects. Genetic effects may not appear until many generations later. The genetic effects of radiation were first demonstrated in fruit flies in the 1920s. It is generally believed that mutation rates depend linearly on dose and that there is no threshold below which mutation rates would not be increased. Third, effect on DNA. Ionizing radiations are known to introduce 2 types of breaks in the sugar phosphate backbone. A single strand break occurs when only one of the sugar phosphate backbones is broken. Single strand breaks are readily repaired using the opposite strand as a template. However, base pair substitutions and frame shift mutations can still occur. Double strand breaks are believed to be the most detrimental effects produced in chromosomes by ionizing radiation. Because such breaks are difficult to repair, they can cause mutations and cell death. Double strand breaks can also result in the loss of DNA fragments, which during the repair process can cause the joining of non-homologous chromosomes, leading to the loss or amplification of chromosomal material. These events can lead to tumorigenesis. Now, non-ionizing radiations. Non-ionizing radiation refers to radiative energy that, instead of producing charged ions when passing through matter, has sufficient energy only for excitation. Non-ionizing radiation has less energy than ionizing radiation. It does not possess enough energy to produce ions. Now, biological effects of non-ionizing radiations. Non-ionizing radiations usually interact with tissues through the generation of heat. The hazards depend on the ability to penetrate the human body and the absorption characteristics of different tissues. prolonged human exposure to solar ultraviolet radiation may result in acute and chronic health effects on the skin, eye, and immune system. Sunburn and tanning are the best known acute effects of excessive ultraviolet radiation exposure. In the long term, ultraviolet radiation induced degenerative change in cells, fibrous tissue, and blood vessels lead to premature skin aging. Ultraviolet radiation can also cause inflammatory reactions of the eye, such as photokeratitis. Chronic effects include two major health problems: skin cancers and cataracts. The nature, extent, and physiological importance of biological effects from non-ionizing radiation exposures will depend on many factors, such as the energy of the incident radiation, source emission characteristics, duration of exposure, environmental conditions, and the spatial orientation. With this, we come to the conclusion of our lecture. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.